Loops are code snippets which repeatedly run many times. In this module, we will discuss how to use loops in JavaScript. Computers are good at doing repeatable tasks extremely fast. Just like the conditional statements, loops are a fundamental aspect of every programming language. Loops are a mechanism that lets the program repeatedly run a part of it till a certain condition is met. Depending on how this condition is defined and checked, we have different kinds of loops. Let's look at each of these in more detail. Every loop has a condition to check, which if true causes the body of the loop to execute, and when false causes the loop to stop and move to the next statement. There are three kinds of loops in JavaScript: the while loop, the do while loop, and the for loop. The while loop, before even executing for the first time, checks for some condition and executes the body of the loop if that condition is true, and keeps on executing till that condition remains true. The do while loop executes the body of the loop at least once and then checks the condition, and while this condition remains true, repeats the code in the loop body. The for loop is usually used when we are able to know how many times the loop body needs to be executed in advance. Let's look at examples of each of these in the coming slides. The while loop. The while loop consists of a test condition and a body of the code. The body of the code is executed only if the test condition is true. Usually, somewhere in the body of the code, the parameters affecting the test condition may change, and if that causes the test condition to become false, then the loop exits. Else, the loop keeps executing and running the body of the code repeatedly. On the right, we see this in the flow chart, where we see that if the test condition is false, then the loop exits. Here is an example of the while loop. Here we initialize a variable counter value to a value of 0. Then the while loop is written with the while keyword and the condition counter value less than 10 in rounded brackets, and then the body of the loop is written in curly braces after that. In the body of the loop, the counter value is incremented by 1 every time the loop executes, and when this value becomes 15, the condition counter value less than 15 becomes false and the loop exits. The control now moves to the last statement, which prints while loop is finished onto the browser. The do while loop is similar to the while loop, except that irrespective of the condition, it always executes the body of the code once. This is because the first check on the condition is done after the body of the code is executed and not before it. So even if the condition is false before the loop starts, the body is still executed once but will not execute the second time. However, in the same way as in the case of a while loop, the body of the loop is executed till the condition remains true. The syntax is the do keyword, then the body of the loop within the curly braces, and then the while keyword, and then the condition which is to be checked in rounded brackets. Here is a similar example of the do while loop. The counter value is initialized to 0. Then do while loop starts with the do keyword followed by the opening curly braces, which form part of the body of the loop. Then in the body of the loop, we increment the value of the counter value. Then the body of the loop closes, and then the while keyword followed by the rounded brackets in which the condition counter value is less than 10 is checked. When the value of the counter value becomes 15, the condition becomes false and the loop exits, printing do while loop is finished in the output. Note that even if you initialize the value of counter value to 15 or a greater number, then also the body of the loop would execute once. Go ahead and change the initial value of the counter value to a large value and see what happens. The for loop. The for loop is usually written when you know in advance how many times you want the body of the loop to be executed. In the case of a while do and do while loops, you may not always know how the condition changes and thus may not have control over how many times the loop body may execute. But for loop lets you have a more fine-grained control over that. The for loop has four main parts: the initialization, the condition to be checked, the increment value, and the body of the loop. The initializer is used to set the start value for the count for the number of loop iterations. The increment is used to increment the value of this counter. The condition is used to test this counter value against exceeding or decreasing from some value, and if this condition is true, the body of the loop is executed. The initialization, condition, and increment are separated through semicolons as shown here. Here is the syntax for the for loop. You have the for keyword, then the opening and closing round brackets. Inside the brackets, the first initialization condition, in this case the value of an integer I equal to 0. Then the condition to be checked, that is whether the value of I is less than the value of count. Then the increment operator, where the value of I is incremented by 1 each time. Then the closing round brackets. Then the opening and closing curly braces, which is the body of the loop. This body of the loop would thus be executed count times. We can always have a check so that the condition could be checked for I greater than count, and then the value of I would be decrementing by 1. You could also increment the value of I by more than 1, thus causing the loop to be executed less than the count times. For example, if we increment the value of I by 2 instead of 1, then the loop would execute count divided by 2 times instead of count times. The basic idea is that we initialize a variable, check that variable against a certain condition, and then vary the value of that variable after every loop iteration, and when that condition fails, then exit the loop. The for loop example. A simple example of when we would use the for loop is shown here. Here we have a variable I which is initialized to a value of 0 in the initialization section of the loop. Then we check for the condition of I less than 10 and then execute the body of the loop. Then we increment the value of I by 1. When this value becomes 10, we will exit the loop. In the body of the loop, we print the current value of I after each iteration of the loop. Each value is separated through a new line by printing the line break character. A practical example of this would be, let's say we have a printer in which we have 10 sheets. We want the printer to print while the sheets last, and in every iteration of the loop it prints one sheet. We increment the value of the counter to show how many sheets are consumed.